enormous trust in Zheng He that he tasks him to build this treasure fleet that you describe and sail it into essentially unknown waters through the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, into the Indian Ocean, onto India, Arabia, and Africa. And just to give everyone a sense of the scale of these ships that Zheng He constructs, these are 500 feet long. They have crews of 400 to 500. They are massive wooden structures. And to compare it, the Santa Maria, which sails almost 100 years later, the flagship of Christopher Columbus, is just over 100 feet long, about a fifth of the size of these massive treasure ships. And everywhere he goes, he leaves the mark of China. He creates a kind of a mercantile set of connections for China, not conquest, but connection and trade. As you mentioned, the Silk Road. This is kind of the maritime Silk Road. And you see echoes of it today, Scott, in the Chinese desire to create a one belt, one road mercantile empire along those same lines. So Zheng He is someone I think quite remarkable, particularly coming from slavery and castration to lead great fleets around the world. Resilience.
And I encourage listeners to go online and look at size comparisons, as you mentioned, with his ships and Columbus's. It's like if a rhino and a meerkat were at an African watering hole and looking at each other. It's shocking how different they are in size.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Now, this is a slight departure, but a lot of work of what I do is trying to debunk historical myths. And one of those has to do with Zheng He because he was so extraordinary. There was a book by, is it Gavin Menzies, who thinks that Zheng He not only discovered the New World, but circumnavigated Greenland. So what do you make of this theory?
I think it is highly unlikely. These are pretty well documented, the voyages of Zheng He. And it is, in my view, if he had made the voyages described in that book, I think we would have more indication of that. And certainly I've seen nothing that truly substantiates that. It's a great story. But I think if you want to know who circumnavigated the globe, it was Magellan first, who didn't quite make it. He died in the course of it, but his expedition. And the second one was actually another of the admirals in sailing true north. It was Sir Francis Drake, both a pirate and a patriot, but someone of extraordinary resilience and decisiveness. He was the first admiral, commander, to go all the way around the world while in command of the same mission. So I think chops go to Drake, not to Zheng He.
And as you said, he left an archaeological trail, and there are Chinese descendants on West African islands. So yeah, we would have seen that. Could you spend a few moments discussing Rear Admiral Grace Hopper? And you mentioned ushering the Navy into the cyber age. So I was completely ignorant of this. Could you spend a few moments on that?
I can. I'd love to. I think Grace Hopper is the admiral voted most likable and the one you want to have a beer with. She was a very small, slight woman. World War II comes along. She has a PhD in mathematics from Yale. She's absolutely brilliant. And she desperately wants to be part of the effort to win the Second World War. She wants to be in the Navy, and she doesn't weigh enough. And so she repeatedly tries to put on weight and reapplies. On the fourth or fifth time, finally, the Navy brings her in, and they put her in charge of a computer science project teamed with IBM and other in early stage, if you will, mainframe builders. And Grace Hopper comes up with the idea of using essentially human language to talk to computers, which is an expletive way of saying she invents the idea of computer languages, of programming. She's really the mother of COBOL, which is one of the early programming languages, which is still used today. She evolved it in the 40s and 50s. I studied it at Annapolis in the 70s, and it is still in use today. Think about that for a moment or two. And she was also immensely likable, down to earth, loved a good practical joke, had immense intellectual curiosity. When she died in her apartment in New York City, small one-bedroom apartment, 10,000 books, an enormous reader. There's a lot to like about Grace Hopper, and we treasure her in the U.S. Navy. Her nickname in the Navy is Amazing Grace, and her spirit sails on in the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Hopper.
How did that affect the Cold War, this digitization of the Navy that happened at the time it did?
Great question. And this was really part of the overarching arms race that drove the Cold War. We tend to think of the missile race, the race to get to the moon, the missile gap. There are a lot of manifestations of the race between the U.S. and NATO and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But I would argue that this digitization, the bringing online of true computational power, it drives fire control, the ability to put a round exactly where you want it to be. It drives acoustics that can quiet a submarine under the Arctic. It drives high-speed, fifth-generation aircraft. All of these fall out of this shift to the computer age, and it's really quite a remarkable story that we tell in Sailing True North of Grace Hopper's role in bringing that, particularly to the Navy. It is absolutely essential. 2 words for her: trailblazer, both as a woman and as a remarkable scientist.
Do you see any common characteristics of good admirals that span this 2,500-year period we're looking at? Because you have triremes you were discussing where people are oaring manually, to sailing ships where sailors would maybe while away time by skylarking, where they're climbing the center mast and probably dying if they fall off the top, to nuclear submarines, nuclear aircraft carriers, and super aircraft carriers, which are, if there's something that is the peak of technological innovation of man that could compete with the space program, you could make a good case for that. Are there any through lines that you see that would unite people across a massive span where a ship is completely unrecognizable from today to someone in the ancient past?
I think that the qualities of inner character are just as true back in Themistocles in ancient Greece, this charismatic leader who wins an epic battle, but then through his own arrogance comes to a tragic ending and is banished and exiled and ends up in the Persian Empire, believe it or not, serving in the court of the son of Xerxes himself. And you can pull that thread all the way forward to Admiral Rickover, who pulled the Navy into the nuclear world, or Admiral Zumwalt, who led the change to integrate the Navy, racially integrate the Navy fully in the 1970s. And I'll give you 3 qualities that I saw again and again and again in the 10 admirals in Sailing True North. One was creativity, innovation, the ability to get away from the traditional and try new things. And really that is back to your point about change is ever present in military technology. We see each of these admirals, one way or another, is willing to try the new. Stephen Jobs of Apple, pretty famous innovator, said the difference between leaders and followers is the courage of innovation. So creativity, innovation, first one. Second is resilience. We've touched on that a couple of times. Not only Zheng He, who starts as a slave and a castrato, Nelson, who faces terrible physical damage himself. He loses an arm, loses an eye, continues to fight. Nimitz, looking at a fleet shattered in front of his eyes. Grace Hopper, facing all the barriers that come with being a woman in a male-dominated organization. All these admirals show great resilience. And lastly, determination, which is certainly related to resilience, but slightly different. Resilience is coming back when something has gone terribly wrong. Determination is setting a goal and refusing to deviate, is just decisiveness moving toward a goal. Every one of these admirals had that as well. So there's 3 qualities that I think shine through in all the admirals in Sailing True North. And I'll close by saying, Scott, all of those qualities apply whether you are an admiral in command of a massive fleet, or as we talked about earlier, whether you are running a small organization, or you're around the Thanksgiving table as the holidays approach, those are pretty good qualities to have in your life. And that's kind of, in the end, why I wrote this book.
I have one final question to wrap things up. There's always chatter online and elsewhere about who's the best this or that across history, military commander, inventor. In your opinion, who is the best admiral in history?
Boy, that's a tough one. I'm going to go with two. I'm going to cheat slightly. So I'm going to say Nimitz, who we've talked about already, who commands the largest fleet in history, the Pacific Fleet. He starts from a broken place and ultimately triumphs. Think about this. The battleship Arizona sunk in front of him. Today is a memorial at Pearl Harbor. Right next to USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor is USS Missouri, also a battleship. That's where the surrender document was signed when we defeated the Japanese Empire. That's a pretty extraordinary span. You've got to put Nimitz at the top. And also in terms of qualities, that kind of quiet confidence, I think, is pretty remarkable. But I think it's hard to overlook Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, Lord Nelson, who we talked about a moment ago. Fearless in battle, a very small guy. Scott, I'm 5'5". I would have towered over Nelson. He was a tiny guy, but he was just incredibly fierce in battle, and he loved his sailors. He took exceptional care of them in an era when most commanders used the lash. He was beloved by his sailors. He was beloved by the captains who were his immediate subordinates. Remarkable in so many dimensions, wins an epic battle for his nation. If you go to London today, go to Trafalgar Square, named for that epic battle, and there on a pinnace at the very top overlooking all of London is the statue of Lord Nelson. So there's two admirals, two different sides of the Atlantic, two different eras. Both won epic existential battles. Both were beloved by their sailors. I'd put those two at the top of my list.
All right, an authoritative statement right there. The book is Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character. Admiral Stavridis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks for bringing your knowledge of history, which is quite extensive, I see, to the conversation. I enjoyed it a great deal.
Okay, so that is all for today. That's today's episode. Thank you for joining me. First off, I want to give a shout out to the Spy Masters for the Knowlton's Rangers. Vic Austin, Chris, Rob Matlock, Alan Baker, Beverly Ingle, Jake Harrington, Todd Warren, William Ivey, Joyce Normant, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Daniel Lawson, Marlene, Michael, Tim Clark, David Powell, Moondoggy from Ohio, Melissa, Christopher Main, Carl from Norway, and Baron Fraser. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.